In today's video, I'm going to show you 3 easy ways to validate the user inputs inside of your Shiny apps. This stuff is important because you don't want to crash your app just because your user put in something that doesn't make sense for your code in the backend. So a good way is to stop the code execution when something bad was used as an input and display something to the user to let him know that he needs to change stuff. So that's the kind of input validation that we're going to do. So without further ado, let's dive in. So in my R script, I've prepared a little dummy app for you that we're going to use for the purposes of this video. It looks like this. We can put in a name into an input field. Let's stick in my name, and then we can select a couple of months like March or April. And then we see a text printed here. So it's a really simple app, but we can already see inside of our console that things already went wrong. We're kind of lucky that things worked out and the app didn't die completely, but we already see some errors here. And the reason these errors occurred is because we didn't actually check whether inputs are already there. So if we have no months input, then we see a new error was generated. And if we have no text input on the name, then we also see that something new is generated. So as a first step, we should always try to make sure that inputs are already there. So we can use our by now well-known function that is require, and we can require that the inputs are already there. So let's put in this first require call, and then let's put in the second require call for this second input here. So now my server will check when it renders this text output whether these two inputs, which are just the select input and the text input that we see in our app, whether these two inputs are there. And if they are, then we can run this epoxy code, which is just like the glue code that assembles text using these placeholder bracket notation. But the nice thing about the epoxy package is that we can put in these .and tags in here to immediately collapse multiple inputs that come as a vector into a sentence that uses AND. So if we have my name here and multiple inputs, we see here that everything is concatenated using commas first, and for the last one we have an AND statement in here. So that's what epoxy does. And now if we restart this app using our current code, then we see that right now, even though there are no inputs yet, there are no warnings or messages inside of our console. Now, require is the first line of defense that allows us to stop code execution when some input is incorrect. But it doesn't actually let the user know what to change. Instead, it just stops everything. This is often not what we want to do because it's kind of poor user experience. Instead, we want to let our user know that he needs to change something. And for that, there is the validate function together with the need function that allows us to do just that. So let's try this. Let's use the validate function, and inside of this validate function, we can say what we need using the need function. And here we can say, okay, we need this, and say something like, please provide a name. And similarly, we can put in another need statement that checks for this month input and that says, please provide a month. And then we don't need the require functions anymore because validate plus need fill that gap or replace what require does. So if we close our app and re-execute this, we see now that our output is generated, but it also says not really what the user put in, but instead it shows us all the things that are still needed with the corresponding warnings that we put in here. So if we put in a name or we start to type, then we see that this warning here is removed. And now if we put in more stuff here, we see that our output is generated just like we wanted to. And here we can make things more interesting by calculating a couple of helper variables that check specific conditions, like whether a name is long enough when we want to have a name, not just a single letter, but at least 3 characters, or we can check whether at least 1, but at most 3 months were selected. And then we can use these helper variables instead and adjust our message here accordingly. Please provide a name of length that is at least 3. And then if we don't have at least 1 month, then we say, please provide a month. And then for the last one, we can also say that we need only 3 months. Then we can say here, please provide only or at most 3 months. So now if we rerun this, we see our warnings here. And if I type in something, then we still see that, okay, this message is still here. But as I'm putting in my name, we see that now this text is long enough and this message disappeared. And here, if we select a month, then we see that things work out nicely. And now if we put in more than 3 months, then we see that it says, please provide at most 3 months. So the user now knows, okay, I will have to take out one. And I know ideally the user isn't even allowed to select the 4th month input, but this isn't the point here. But still, I want to show you how you could do that, namely by looking into the select input documentation, where you'll find that there is also the selectize input function that also has this options argument. So let's use that. And then inside of the options, we can put in a list of options. So let's stick in a list. And to find out what options we have, we could follow this link here. And there we'd find that the max items argument or this option can be set to 3. And now if we rerun this, then if we select 3 months, we see that we cannot select any more months. So this is also a valid way to avoid having to validate something in the first place. But still, this requires you to still use this initial message to tell the user to provide at least 1 month and a name that is of at least length 3. Now, it would be nice if we can also give our users more visual cues as to which particular input is the one that is currently incorrect. So I'm thinking like highlighting this particular input to mark it as red so that the user knows that this particular input is still incorrect. And with the Shinyvalidate package, it's really easy to do that. So let me show you how. So let us load this package. Let's call library, do Shinyvalidate. And then inside of our server function, we can create an input validator object using this new method from the input validator. And then using our input validator, we can decide to add a new validation rule using the add rule function, where we say that we target a specific input ID using a function that checks what this input is supposed to be. And in our case, we can just use one of the pre-specified functions from the Shinyvalidate package. In this case, it is just the required function that checks whether some input was made. And similarly, we can do the exact same thing for our other input. And then there's one more thing we have to do, namely, we have to enable our input validator. And now we can restart our app and we see that our inputs are inside of a red frame. And we also see this required messages here. Also, there's even an icon that tells us that something is required. Now, if we wanted to, we could just take out this validate call here and instead just use our good old require function and then use from the IV object the method is valid. And that way the code is only executed if all the conditions, all the rules from the input validator are accepted or are fulfilled. That's probably a better way to say it. But here we haven't actually checked for the other conditions that we want to check here, namely whether an input name is long enough or whether we only have at most 3 months. So let's add more rules to this. And if we want to figure out how to do this, we can look into the documentation of this input validator object. And there we see all the functions that are available. Namely, there's also this add rule. And for the rule argument, we can say that this is a function that takes at least one argument, namely the input value. And the function should return null if it passes validation. And if not, a single element, character, vector, or HTML tag containing the error message. So fundamentally, this must be what this required function does. It returns a function that fulfills these specifications. But if we have custom rules, we can write our own function. So let's do that. Let's copy this in here and say we are creating our own validation function that is an anonymous function using an input that we call x. And then it checks exactly what we check here. So let's put in this long enough name in here as well. But of course, we now have to make this dependent on this variable x. And then if this long enough name is true, then we could technically return something, but we want to return null if everything is okay. So we need to only return something if everything is not okay. So if our good condition is negated. And in this case, we can just return a string that says, please provide a name of length that is at least 3. So let's check if this worked. Right now, we're still getting the required check because we haven't haven't made any input, but if I put in a name that is too short, it says exactly what we put into the message here. Similarly, we can do the exact same thing with the other input. So let's take this input ID, use this condition here, make sure that it depends on the function input, and then if this condition isn't met, we throw the error message that we want to display. And then if we try this out, right now we cannot actually select more than 3 things, but if we were to comment out this part here and re-execute, then we see that it shows us our warning message here. Also, we are now free to decide whether we want to have validate here still present, and then we don't need to require here. In that case, we get the shape of the output already, which is kind of nice, and we also have some duplication of these warnings. At the end of the day, it's your choice what you prefer. Nice. With that, we have learned 3 ways to do validation. Let me know in the comments if you've already known all 3 of these, or if something was new to you. Also, feel free to share topics that you want me to cover next. And if you want to see more Shiny videos, make sure to check out my Shiny video series. Or if you want to see some other R content, I also have another video series for that as well. And now, with all of that said, I say thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.